Today's episode of Heads and Tails is recorded with James Priory, Headmaster of Tonbridge School, and what a kind, positive guy he is. I really enjoyed speaking to him. We cover the power of storytelling in teaching and education. We talk about different forms of mentorship in his own life and professional development, how to find joy as a teacher and a student, and there are plenty of other great personal anecdotes in there as well. We hope you enjoy the episode. This episode is sponsored by Tonbridge as part of a paid partnership, but as with all episodes of Heads and Tails, the content is editorially independent. Okay, welcome back to Heads and Tails with me, Henry Faber. I'm one of the co-founders here at Oppenheimer Education, and it's a real privilege today to be joined by James Priory, who has been headmaster at Tonbridge School, a really, really good school, since August 2018. James was educated at King Edward's, Birmingham initially as the beneficiary of an assisted place, which I know he's very passionate about as a theme and a topic. Maybe we'll hear a bit more about that today. And then after school was at Lincoln College, Oxford, where he got a first-class English degree, of course, before starting his first teaching post at Bradford Grammar School. There we go, excuse me. He moved on to Portsmouth Grammar School in 2000 and had a really remarkable rise through that school, eventually becoming the first internally appointed headmaster there in almost 200 years. So we'd love to hear how that's been possible. James chairs the governing body education committee of Marsh Academy, a fellow member of the Skinner's family of schools, and he's also a governor of Homewood House, a lovely prep school that, quite near Tonbridge, and Bickley Park School, as he sits as well on HMC's education committee. I know he's passionate about choral music, theatre, performance, sports. James is married to fellow English teacher Helen, and they have 3 children. I'm really excited to talk to you today, James, because we have 2 people in the office who've worked closely with you and know you well. So it's a real privilege to get the inside scoop on what makes your career so special. So thank you.
Thanks, Henry. That's very kind. It's great to be with you.
So you know that here at Oppenheimer we are obsessed with all things mentorship. So I have to start on mentoring. Reflections on mentorship. Have you had mentors along the way? In what shape or form have those taken?
Yeah, they've taken many forms and shapes, and both informal and formal. I think one of the things I'm conscious of, and I'm not sure this is always every head's experience, if I'm honest, is being that the relationship I've had with my chairs of governors in different schools and at different times has always been a really strong one. And each of them have taken on a guise of mentor in that role, rather than me ever feeling that I'm kind of necessarily answering to them as such, although obviously in a technical sense I am. But I've always felt that like we've been in dialogue and that their wisdom, their life experience, but shared with their passion for education, because they wouldn't be in that role otherwise, has meant they've been extraordinary mentors. And they've been very different people, from admirals to financiers, to lawyers, but really interesting people. And I feel very lucky in that. If there's one person who I probably would pick out who's been a mentor and friend through pretty much a large part of my career, it would be Tim Hands, who was formerly, most recently, headmaster at Winchester College, and was my predecessor at Portsmouth, where he appointed me as head of English back in 2000, as you said a moment ago. And I think there was something kind of infectious about Tim in terms of his humour, which continues to be the case. It still foxes me occasionally, but it's always kind of, it's well worth the patience. He's an extraordinarily erudite and enthusiastic man. But actually, it was also what I learned from him was not just kind of good humour, but also actually a real dedication to the lives of children and young people. And that's characterised his time when he was chair of HMC. A real passion for boosting the profile of the city where the school was in Portsmouth. He had some really visionary ideas about the arts and the profile of the city, which was exciting to inherit as a role. But he's also just been a very personal kind of wise friend. It was him who kind of encouraged me to think about Tonbridge as somewhere where I might be very happy, and he's proved right. The only thing I would say is that trying to follow your mentor as a head isn't necessarily easy. And of course, that can mean that there's a challenge in feeling that the school is your own, and rather actually you kind of get a bit consumed by the tension of feeling you have to fulfill their vision. And of course, that wasn't what he was imposing on me, but it was perhaps self-imposed. And it probably took me a couple of years at Portsmouth just to realize, look, this is your ship, your school, so get on with it, because Tim's moved on. And I think that was probably a good life lesson in leadership. But I'm delighted he's now on the board here at Tonbridge, and great to be working with him again in that mentoring role.
Full circle. That's amazing. Really, really fascinating. And beautifully eloquent kickoff to the conversation, so thank you. I'd love to dig just a tiny bit more into the mentoring piece while we're on it. How does all that experience of being mentored as an adult through your, industry or your career, how has that inferred how you've perceived mentorship taking place within the schools that you've run? Does it have a leaning on kind of how you steer that mentoring ship within a school like Tunbridge?
Yeah, I think I've probably, if I'm honest, as I've progressed in kind of leadership and in my experience of headship, I've probably become more open. And I'm sure this is quite a common experience, but I've become more open to the value of mentor roles for colleagues with whom I work, recognizing that I can't always necessarily give them the time or necessarily have the expertise that they need to really help them fulfill themselves in their roles. And sometimes perhaps trying to assume that you're going to be the best mentor for everyone in your team is perhaps a mistake. Much as you obviously play an important facilitating role and an enabling role. So I can think of a couple of examples where actually it's been really, I think, good to suggest to colleagues actually the development of a relationship with a coach or mentor outside of school who's been able to work with them individually without perhaps them feeling quite the pressure of being accountable to that person as such. So that's perhaps an approach I've adopted a little bit more in more recent years, where I felt that it's been kind of particularly helpful for an individual, perhaps growing into a new role or perhaps managing a period of transition with a team. And of course, thinking about that for myself too. Of course, one of the big things that schools have always been, I think, or great schools have been good at doing is that peer mentoring role for young people themselves. And that's easily said, it's less easily done well. And one of the things I found really interesting coming here at Tunbridge has been the kind of the vertical relationship that you have in the house system that we have both in boarding and in day. I think really does give a very natural opportunity for older pupils to play a very serious mentoring role to younger pupils, not just as accidental role models, but directly kind of mentoring. And I think, that can establishing that kind of relationship at school perhaps gives it an opportunity for it to be something that's then developed further in life.
I feel like you've given me an incredibly kind steer there into what Opperton does, which is set up peer mentoring initiatives in school and train students to be mentors to one another.
Well, which I was
So,
aware of.
so we're singing from the same hymn sheet there. I've spent the best part of 10 years trying to do exactly what you've just described. So that's great to hear. Perhaps an anecdote from the more youthful version of James. Not that James is not youthful right now, but the most youthful version. The most youthful version. Is there an anecdote that tells us a bit about how your experiences in education yourself shaped who you've become as an adult?
I don't know whether I can quite deliver that in the anecdote that comes to mind, if I'm honest, but I'm going to share it. It's slightly quirky. In some ways, it's forced me to kind of think, why is this a moment that comes back to me and makes me smile? But it often does. I remember at school in Birmingham doing a lot of drama, and I was in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Mark Twain. Great story, not an easy one to bring to stage, of course. But nonetheless, a great story. And in my recollection, I'm Huckleberry Finn, but I may have just cast myself in that role through the distortion of memory. But I do remember that I hadn't remembered my lines very well, and we were, in fact, I think it was a cast. We were pretty much letting down the director in this regard. And there was a moment when we were all on stage, I think, in the kind of a rehearsal of the finale, which had pretty much fallen flat. And the teacher, Giles Evans, a great English teacher, great man, stood up. He was a big guy, and he absolutely berated us on the stage. And we were humbled, humiliated, silenced, and let us know, the concerns he had. He then turned promptly and fell absolutely flat on his face. And he was a big guy going down hard. And there was this moment of kind of shock and horror. It wasn't kind of mockery or anything. It was just absolute shock and awe. He got up, didn't say a word. I'd love to say we all erupted in kind of hilarity and we all hugged. That wasn't the case. But I think what happened in that moment when he fell was actually he made his point more powerfully than he did in the berating, because we suddenly saw that actually he really cared. We were letting him down, almost literally. And from that moment on, we dug a bit deeper and we really got to grips with those lines. And it's always made me smile just thinking about it since, teachers, authoritative figures laid low, but in some ways, actually through that humility, their point made more powerfully.
That's well put. It brings to mind an experience I had in a school play age 16 where we were just told by the director to be better. and that stuck with me too, but for slightly different reasons. Um, I'm sure your glittering career hasn't always been totally easy, and there have been things that have been really tricky to navigate. So perhaps, as concisely as possible, a tough moment and then a highlight as well. We'll finish with the positive, but something you reflect back on both from an up and a down.
Yeah, I think what comes to mind immediately, of course, are those moments when you lose a member of your community, a member of staff, a pupil, of course, even more powerfully so. And I think the challenge of trying to manage the human emotions of that situation, with which you identify so powerfully, and yet somehow maintain enough objectivity to communicate and just think through what you have to do in those situations. Those are incredibly testing moments. I wish they're not moments that I had to go through. But actually, if I was to think really of a moment that being particularly tough, I probably would think, and I realize it may be a bit cliche, but it is the moment, I think, when we had to shut the school down and of course went into COVID and the pandemic. I remember thinking about a predecessor who had joined the school in 1939, and he'd had to consider whether or not to evacuate the school at that time, and had made the tough decision not to before he'd even arrived here. And I remember thinking, God, thank goodness I'm never going to have to deal with anything quite like that. But actually, from the whole experience of COVID, we learned a huge amount too. And it was liberating in a strange way, because it kind of threw the rule book up in the air, and you just had to back yourself with the decisions and be willing to revisit things, but also listen to advice. So huge amount learned from that time. So tough time, isolating, of course, in its very nature, but also, learned a huge amount about actually the ability to innovate in a tough situation and maintain a very high quality of learning experience, and then come back with those lessons learned. Did you ask me to about kind of a bit more of a highlight?
Yeah, let's go with a highlight. Yeah. Let's go with a highlight. Let's pick up spirits.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll tell you what, a moment that comes to mind there, which really was kind of personally really rewarding actually, was I got a call from a former student at Bradford Grammar School called John Hollingworth. He said, dropped me a line out of the blue, to be honest. We'd not been in touch for many, many years. And he just dropped me a line saying, look, I'm playing a role in at the Globe in London. I'd love you to come and watch. Wonderful. And the role he was playing was Antony and Antony and Cleopatra. And I had taught him the play when I was in my very early 20s, relying heavily on my own teacher's notes and my own A-level experience of the play. But I do remember, or at least he reminded me, that actually he played the role of Antony in class, and I said, actually, you're pretty good at this. And for a young boy to play the role of Antony was quite a challenge, but he had a presence, and he's gone on to have a very interesting, successful acting career. But to see him in that production at the Globe, oh my gosh, and to perhaps realize that my own teacher's notes, John Carrington at Taunton School, who taught me that, and had now given his name to the library there, and those early days fumbling around as a 20-year-old, trying to work out what I was doing in that classroom, but nonetheless sharing that love of Shakespeare. To see that culminate in his performance on the stage was extraordinary, a special moment.
How gratifying. I think, yeah, I mentioned to you before, you and I share an interest in theatre and in performance. And my big takeaway from school and my experience there was being told by people in drama and performance, you can do this and you are able and you're capable, and you have the ability to make something like this come alive. And that's an extraordinary thing to be given as a strength, as a superpower when you're a teenager, and to be shown, okay, your career in this might be difficult, it might be tough, but there is a career there, you can do it. And clearly for John, that was the case. So what a great story. Moving straight from performance onto content. Are you a reader, a watcher, a listener? I'd love to hear how you get your content when you possibly find the time. And perhaps you've got some recommendations for us that you'd be happy to stand up behind.
Yeah, happily. I mean, if I'm honest, it tends to be reserved to holiday time. I find it quite hard to get into a book and sustain a kind of the other world of a story during term time. And I wish I could do that more easily. But I find that I'm still kind of thinking, processing the 101 other narratives that are happening around you in the life of the school. But I do find a great pleasure and not much difficulty, if I'm honest, in diving into things come the holiday and bringing back that nourishment to term life. I think a great example of that would be a book that certainly inspired me as an English teacher, which was Jonathan Smith's The Learning Game. A very humble, simple book, but very beautifully crafted and a kind of personal memoir in which he really explores and reflects on his life as a teacher and the ability to learn from your pupils. And he weaves into it the poetry of Edward Thomas, who I'm a big fan of, and was someone I'd discovered just prior to university, almost by accident actually at the time. He wasn't that well known as a writer, and developed a great love for his poetry, his exploration of self. And I do think that book, The Learning Game, as an insight into the importance of making young people think, but also making them laugh, and the ability to engage, but also deepen their thinking at the same time, was a craft that he explores in that book and certainly has inspired me and many, many others. Jonathan was formerly head of English here at Tonbridge and a real legend, and still writing, still very much connected with the community here. So if there's one book I would recommend to an aspirant teacher, it would certainly be that one.
Lovely. Great bit of content. I'm going to look that up straight away. The Learning Game. Thank you. Education is a layered, complex place at the best of times, no more so than at the moment. Unpopular and controversial opinions, we all probably have them, but rarely get to voice them. So I'm putting you slightly on the spot by seeing if you'd be happy to stand up behind one of them. And I should say, as forewarning, that we had the head of a teaching union give her unpopular opinion as humans being too interested in dogs rather than other humans. So it doesn't necessarily need to be something particularly highbrow, but I'm interested to see where you head with it.
That is interesting, actually. We're dog owners, and I have a wife who's a dog owner who absolutely adores that dog, and I've learnt, to overcome the issues of self-esteem it's created for me. But it has led to me kind of wondering, have we got the balance quite right as a society in the extent to which we're welcoming canines into it? But that's too sensitive to pursue further. Do you know, I have got a belief in the value of chapel, and I'm realised that may not always be the most popular kind of element of the life of a school that one wants to promote, or certainly for a teenage boy to think that that's necessarily where they want to spend their time, perhaps particularly so on a Sunday night. But we do have a bit, for us pastorally as a school, regathering on a Sunday evening, with our boarders coming back is important for us. And actually the cultural time, the spiritual opportunity, and just the rhythm of that coming together as a community. It's very interesting that when people come back to the school years later, that's where they gravitate, their house and the chapel. Sport plays a bit of a part too, of course, but it is interesting that. And so I suppose, in a way, kind of being confident about that belief, even though there has been quite a fundamental shift in our society and in family life and the experience of chapel, church worship, just having the confidence to recognize the value of that personally, I think perhaps does require a bit of conviction at times.
I think I look back and think of the buildings and the music and the headspace that place provides. It's sort of, if you think about it, you can be religious or non-religious. It definitely inspires a sense of nostalgia and mystery and calm, I suppose, particularly in a boarding school environment where you're busy all the time for the right reasons, but a wonderful chance to detach. I think that's lovely. That is the first time we've had an answer down that alleyway, and I think it's a really interesting thing to think about as we kind of reflect on how religion or spirituality sits within the landscape of education in this country. So that's a lovely point. We have all sorts of people listen to this podcast, from teachers but to wider educators or people interested in education. So it's sector wide. I'm wondering if you've got a piece of advice for those who are in the sector or want to be in the sector that's carried you well through your years to date.
I think I would say it's advice that I had when I was at an early stage in my teaching, and it's advice I had again actually from a pretty wise person when I took on my first headship. And I remember them saying to me very simply, enjoy it and be seen to enjoy it. And that's not necessarily to create a pressure that somehow you've got to have a permanent smile on your face, because sometimes it's actually quite powerful not to smile, and to show that you're not particularly pleased or happy with something, or that something hasn't gone well, is okay. But actually trying to find the joy in what you're doing really matters, particularly in education, because if you're not enjoying it, no one else is going to. And we're very lucky as educators that you have got, particularly if I'm honest, in the independent sector, I think we're particularly privileged in the sense that we have the autonomy to really create opportunities, pursue experiences, devise approaches that really, can also enrich and excite us and be around areas of our own passion and interest, because that will communicate itself to the students we teach. And that's true as well in the maintained sector. My wife teaches in the maintained sector, and I know exactly that's her experience and approach. But sometimes there's a nobility in suffering, and sometimes we feel that there's a heroism in letting everyone know how hard you're working, and we kind of feel culturally kind of cautious about being able to admit we're actually enjoying it, and find the joy would be my message, because actually that will pay dividends in the rapport and relationship of your pupils, but also as you progress in leadership with your team.
Amazing. Lovely piece of advice. And to finish, I've got one more sneaky question to shove in, which is really just about Tonbridge and what next for you and the school. Tricky time for the independent sector more broadly. What's getting you excited on the horizon for the school and your plans there?
Yeah, it is a really challenging time. There's no doubt, and of course, that's making everybody kind of think hard about the priorities, and also about the value that they're offering in order to justify their presence in what is a competitive marketplace. And when people are having to think very, very hard about the investment they're making in their children's education, um, to some extent, it's about having confidence about what you're already doing. We're an all boys school, and we do believe really strongly that what we're offering for young men is perhaps even more relevant today, in terms of the experience, life, and education that they're gaining here about developing themselves fully, as rounded, grounded young men, and actually having confidence about that, is actually quite exciting, to really kind of be confident that the quality of program we're offering and the range of experiences is, if anything, even more relevant than it was. But we are looking at things such as how we develop some of the creative aspects of the boys' experience. I'm a big believer in the power of storytelling. I've seen you've had other guests for whom that's also something that really resonates for them, and in education, perhaps not surprisingly. And we're doing some really interesting things around the kind of creative experience the boys have, their ability to tell stories and to communicate. Our kind of informal motto is "Only connect." And we think that relates, both to ideas, but it also relates to people. And just thinking about how that's embedded in the experience the boys have here, alongside all the academic and co-curricular things they do, that's exciting for us at the moment. But if anything, it's really kind of trying to distill the relevance of what we're doing for the boys who come here and the young men that they become, and the influence they're going to have in the wider world, and their confidence in their part in that.
A wonderful way to end. Thank you so much. You've shared a lot of wisdom, very eloquently put. Clearly, someone interested in performance and with a lot of talent for it. You've been kind to give us the time. I hope the rest of the summer term is smooth sailing towards a long summer holiday, and really appreciate you being with us today. So thank you, James.
Thanks, Henry.